The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the bridal suite as Michael's fingers closed around my throat. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see our son David adjusting his dress blues one final time before walking down the aisle to marry the love of his life. The irony wasn't lost on me that while our boy was about to pledge his devotion to another human being, his father was threatening to strangle his own wife over money. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "You're going to sign those papers right now, Rachel," Michael hissed, his breath hot against my face. "Or I swear to God, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." The stock option documents lay scattered across the antique vanity where I'd been touching up my lipstick just moments before. $3.2 million worth of shares in the tech consulting company I'd built from nothing, and Michael wanted every penny of it to save his failing construction business. What he didn't know was that I'd been expecting this moment for weeks, and I was more than ready for him. My name is Rachel Thompson, and I'm 52 years old. For the past 15 years, I've been the wife of Michael Thompson, a man I thought I knew completely until 3 months ago when everything I believed about our marriage began to unravel. Today should have been one of the happiest days of our lives, watching our son David marry Jennifer Walsh in the beautiful Riverside Gardens Event Center here in Portland, Oregon. Instead, I was fighting for my financial independence while trying to keep my composure long enough to get through the ceremony. The morning had started like any other wedding day, with that electric mixture of excitement and chaos that comes with orchestrating a major family celebration. I'd been awake since 5 a.m., coordinating with the florists, the caterers, and the wedding planner to ensure everything would be perfect for David and Jennifer. Our Tudor-style home in the West Hills had been transformed into mission control, with relatives arriving from across the country and last-minute details requiring constant attention. David looked magnificent in his marine dress uniform, every inch the decorated soldier who'd just returned from his second deployment overseas. At 28, he'd grown into the kind of man who commanded respect wherever he went, but when he hugged me that morning, he was still my little boy who used to build forts in our backyard and beg for extra bedtime stories. "Mom, you look incredible," he'd said, spinning me around in my navy silk dress that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Jennifer's going to be so jealous of how beautiful you look." I'd laughed and smoothed down his collar, the way I'd done 1,000 times before when he was small. "This is her day, sweetheart. I'm just here to cry happy tears and embarrass you with too many photographs." Michael had been unusually quiet during the morning preparations, checking his phone constantly and excusing himself for what he claimed were last-minute business calls. I'd attributed his distracted behavior to wedding day nerves, but looking back now, I realize he'd been finalizing his plan to corner me when I'd have no choice but to comply with his demands. The ceremony itself had been everything David and Jennifer had dreamed of. The Riverside Gardens Event Center overlooked the Willamette River, with the Portland skyline creating a stunning backdrop for their vows. Jennifer looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, and when David's voice cracked with emotion as he promised to love and protect her, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. I'd sat in the front row, clutching my small bouquet of white roses, and feeling proud beyond words. Michael sat beside me, playing the role of the devoted father perfectly, even reaching over to squeeze my hand when David mentioned how grateful he was for parents who'd shown him what real love looked like. During the cocktail hour, while guests mingled on the terrace and enjoyed locally sourced appetizers, Michael had pulled me aside with what I thought was going to be a sweet moment of shared parental pride. Instead, he'd steered me toward the bridal suite, claiming he wanted to show me something important that couldn't wait. "Rachel, we need to talk," he'd said, his voice carrying an edge I'd rarely heard before. "There's something you need to understand about our financial situation." I'd followed him into the elegant room where Jennifer had gotten ready, thinking perhaps he wanted to discuss our gift to the newlyweds or coordinate our remarks for the reception toasts. The bridal suite was beautifully appointed, with silk wallpaper and antique furniture that spoke to the venue's attention to detail. Champagne glasses from the wedding party's pre-ceremony celebration still sat on the marble-topped vanity, and Jennifer's street clothes hung neatly in the armoire. Michael had closed the door behind us, and immediately his entire demeanor changed. The loving husband and proud father disappeared, replaced by someone I'd never seen before. His eyes were cold, calculating, and when he spoke, his voice carried a menace that made my skin crawl. Northwest Construction Group is in serious financial trouble, he'd said without preamble. We owe $800,000 to investors who aren't the kind of people you want to disappoint. The only way out is to use your stock options as collateral for an emergency loan. I'd stared at him in shock, trying to process what he was telling me. Northwest Construction Group was Michael's company, the business he'd built from a small residential contractor into one of Portland's most successful commercial construction firms. He'd always been proud of his independence, his ability to provide for our family without needing anyone else's help. "Michael, what are you talking about?" I'd asked, genuine confusion in my voice. "The company has been profitable for years. Just last month, you were talking about expanding into the Seattle market." That's when his mask had slipped completely. The Seattle expansion was a disaster. We overextended ourselves on 3 major projects, and when the commercial real estate market took a downturn, we were left holding contracts that were bleeding money. I've been trying to manage the situation quietly, but the investors are demanding their money back, and they're not going to wait much longer. The stock options he was referring to were my most valuable asset, representing 15 years of building Thompson Tech Solutions from a one-woman consulting operation into a thriving software development firm. We were 6 months away from going public, and early estimates suggested my shares would be worth over $3 million once the IPO launched. It was my security, my independence, and the culmination of everything I'd worked for since starting my own business. "Those stock options are mine, Michael," I'd said firmly. "They represent my work, my company, my future. I'm not using them to bail out your business mistakes." That's when he'd grabbed me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The physical violence was shocking, not just because of its suddenness, but because Michael had never laid a hand on me in anger during our entire marriage. We'd had our disagreements over the years, certainly, but he'd never been physically aggressive. Now his fingers were wrapped around my throat, and I could see a desperation in his eyes that was genuinely frightening. "You don't understand," he'd hissed. "These aren't the kind of people who accept bankruptcy court settlements. They want their money, and if they don't get it, they'll take it out of our family. Do you want David to come home from his honeymoon to find his parents in the hospital? Or worse?" I'd remained calm despite the pressure on my throat, drawing on reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. "Let go of me, Michael. Right now." He'd released me immediately, probably realizing that physically assaulting me in the bridal suite of our son's wedding venue wasn't going to accomplish his goals. But the damage was done. In that moment, I'd seen who Michael really was underneath the successful businessman facade, and I knew our marriage was over. "Rachel, please," he'd said, his voice shifting to a pleading tone. "I know this is a shock, but I've been trying to protect you from worrying about the business problems. I thought I could handle it myself, but things have gotten out of control. Your stock options are the only asset we have that's valuable enough to solve this problem." I'd adjusted my dress and picked up the scattered documents from the vanity, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Michael, you just threatened me and put your hands on me. Whatever problems you're facing with your business, they're your problems. My stock options are not available to fix your mistakes." His face had darkened again, and for a moment I thought he might grab me a second time. Instead, he'd moved to block the door, preventing me from leaving the room. "You're not thinking clearly," he'd said. "This affects our entire family. If Northwest Construction Group goes under, it'll destroy our reputation, our social standing, everything we've built together. The investors I'm dealing with have connections throughout the business community. They'll make sure we never work in this city again." What Michael didn't know was that I'd been aware of his financial problems for weeks. Not the full extent, certainly, but enough to know that something was seriously wrong with his business. The signs had been there for anyone paying attention. The late-night phone calls he'd taken as steady, the way he'd started scrutinizing our household expenses, the tension he'd carry in his shoulders when he thought no one was looking. Thompson Tech Solutions had given me more than just financial independence over the years. Running a successful consulting firm had taught me to read people, to notice when clients were being less than truthful about their project requirements or budget constraints. Those same skills had helped me recognize when my own husband was hiding something significant. 3 weeks earlier, I'd hired James Porter, a private investigator recommended by my attorney, to look into Michael's business affairs. What James had uncovered was worse than I'd imagined. Northwest Construction Group wasn't just facing temporary cash flow problems. The company was essentially insolvent, kept afloat only by increasingly desperate measures that bordered on fraudulent. The Seattle expansion Michael had mentioned was indeed a disaster, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. He'd been systematically overbidding on contracts to generate immediate cash flow, then using money from new projects to pay for cost overruns on previous jobs. It was a classic Ponzi scheme approach that could only end in complete collapse. More disturbing was the identity of the investors he'd referenced. According to James Porter's research, Michael had borrowed money from Kevin Martinez, a businessman with rumored connections to organized crime. Martinez's investment group was known for making high-interest loans to construction companies in financial distress, then using aggressive collection methods when payments were missed. Standing in that bridal suite, listening to Michael's increasingly desperate pleas, I realized that everything I'd suspected was true. My husband had gambled away his company's future and was now trying to use my life's work to cover his losses. The fact that he'd chosen our son's wedding day to make his demands told me everything I needed to know about his character. "Michael, I need you to listen to me very carefully," I'd said, my voice steady and calm. "I'm going to walk out of this room, and we're going to finish celebrating David and Jennifer's wedding. Tomorrow, when they've left for their honeymoon, and our guests have gone home, we'll sit down and discuss your financial situation like adults. But I'm not signing anything today, and I'm not making any decisions under duress in a bridal suite." He'd stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to decide whether to escalate the situation further or accept that his ambush had failed. Finally, he'd stepped away from the door, but his expression remained dark and threatening. "This isn't over, Rachel," he'd said quietly. "You think you can just walk away from our family's problems, but you're wrong. We're in this together, whether you like it or not." I'd gathered my composure, checked my appearance in the mirror, and walked out of that room with my head held high. The cocktail hour was still in full swing, and I'd rejoined our guests with a smile on my face, playing the role of the happy mother of the groom, while my mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. David had approached me shortly after I'd returned to the reception, his face creased with concern. "Mom, are you okay? You look a little pale." I'd reached up to adjust his boutonniere, using the familiar gesture to ground myself in the moment. "I'm perfect, sweetheart. Just overwhelmed by how handsome you look and how happy Jennifer makes you." He'd smiled and kissed my forehead, the same way he'd done as a child when he sensed I needed comfort. "I love you, Mom. Thank you for making today so special." As I'd watched him walk back to his new wife, I'd made a decision that would change everything. Michael thought he could intimidate me into sacrificing my financial security to cover his business failures. He thought that 15 years of marriage meant I would automatically prioritize his needs over my own well-being. He thought I was the kind of woman who would be controlled by threats and physical intimidation. Michael Thompson had severely underestimated his wife. The reception proceeded beautifully, with David and Jennifer dancing their first dance to the same song Michael and I had chosen for our own wedding 15 years earlier. I'd watched them spin around the dance floor, so obviously in love and optimistic about their future together, and I'd felt a strange mixture of joy for them and sadness for what Michael and I had lost. During dinner, Michael had given a toast that was worthy of an acting award. He'd spoken eloquently about love, commitment, and the importance of family. He'd praised Jennifer for making David so happy and had thanked all our guests for sharing this special day with us. He'd even mentioned how proud he was of the strong, independent woman David had chosen to marry, describing Jennifer as someone who knew her own worth and wouldn't settle for anything less than she deserved. The irony was staggering. Michael was publicly celebrating his daughter-in-law's strength and independence, while privately trying to destroy his own wife's financial autonomy. Every word of his toast felt like another layer of betrayal, another reminder that the man I'd married was capable of stunning hypocrisy. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I'd found myself standing alone on the terrace, looking out at the Portland skyline and processing everything that had happened. The city lights reflected off the Willamette River, creating a scene that should have been romantic and peaceful. Instead, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump into an uncertain future. Michael had joined me on the terrace. probably thinking he could use the romantic setting to convince me to reconsider his demands. "It's been a beautiful day," he'd said, standing close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with the champagne he'd been drinking. "Yes, it has," I'd agreed. David and Jennifer looked so happy. They did. He'd paused, and I could feel him gathering himself for another attempt at persuasion. "Rachel, about what we discussed earlier. I know I handled it poorly, but I hope you understand that I'm just trying to protect our family." I'd turned to face him directly, and for the first time that day, I'd let him see the full extent of my anger and disappointment. "Michael, you grabbed my throat and threatened me. You chose our son's wedding day to ambush me with demands about my stock options. You've been lying to me about your business for months, and now you want me to believe you're trying to protect our family?" He'd had the grace to look ashamed, but I could see the desperation still lurking behind his eyes. "I know I made mistakes, but if you don't help me, we're gonna lose everything. The house, our reputation, our standing in the community. Is that what you want?" "What I want," I'd said quietly, "is a husband who respects me enough to include me in important decisions, instead of trying to manipulate and threaten me into compliance. What I want is a partner who sees my success as something to celebrate, not something to exploit when he gets into trouble." Michael had stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to process the fact that his intimidation tactics had backfired completely. "So that's it? You're going to let our marriage fall apart over money?" "No, Michael," I'd replied. "You're going to let our marriage fall apart because you chose to handle your problems by threatening your wife instead of working with her as an equal partner." The last guests had departed shortly after midnight, and David and Jennifer had left for their honeymoon suite at the downtown Marriott. Michael and I had ridden home in silence, each lost in our own thoughts about what would happen next. The house felt enormous and empty after the day's celebrations, filled with the echoes of laughter and congratulations that now seemed to belong to a different lifetime. As we'd stood in our kitchen, still in our wedding attire, Michael had made one final attempt to salvage his plan. "Rachel, I'm begging you. Just think about what I'm asking. $3 million would solve all our problems and secure our future. The company is going public in 6 months anyway. What difference does it make if we access that money now, instead of later?" I'd looked at him across the Marble Island, where we'd shared thousands of meals over the years, where we'd helped David with homework and planned family vacations and celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. This kitchen had been the heart of our home, the place where we'd built our life together. Now it felt like a battlefield where the final shots of our marriage were being fired. "The difference," I'd said, "is that those stock options represent my work, my vision, my 15 years of building something from nothing. They're not marital assets to be liquidated whenever you make poor business decisions. They're my independence, my security, and my future." Michael's face had hardened again, and I could see the manipulative husband returning. "Your future is tied to mine whether you like it or not. If I go down, you go down with me. That's what marriage means." "No, Michael," I'd said, heading toward the stairs. "That's what you think marriage means. To me, marriage means partnership, respect, and mutual support. It doesn't mean one person gets to threaten and intimidate the other into financial submission." As I'd climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I'd heard him slam his fist against the kitchen counter, followed by the sound of his footsteps heading toward his study. I'd known he was probably making phone calls, trying to find alternative solutions to his financial crisis, but I'd also known that his problems were beyond simple fixes. Lying in bed that night, still wearing my navy silk dress because I'd been too emotionally exhausted to change, I'd stared at the ceiling and processed the complete transformation of my life in the span of a single day. This morning I'd been a proud mother celebrating her son's wedding. Tonight I was a woman planning her escape from a marriage that had become a prison. What Michael didn't know was that his threats had actually clarified something I'd been struggling with for months: the distance I'd been feeling in our relationship, the sense that we were growing apart, the way he'd been treating me more like an employee than a partner. It all made sense now. He'd never seen me as an equal. He'd seen me as a resource to be managed and exploited when necessary. The stock options were just the catalyst. The real issue was that Michael believed he had the right to make unilateral decisions about my life, my work, and my financial future. He believed that 15 years of marriage gave him ownership over everything I'd built independently. He believed that threats and intimidation were acceptable tools for getting what he wanted from his wife. Michael Thompson was about to discover that he'd been living with a stranger. The quiet, supportive wife he thought he could push around was about to become his worst nightmare. I'd spent 15 years building a successful business by outthinking my competition and anticipating problems before they became crises. Now I was going to use those same skills to protect myself from my own husband. As I'd finally drifted off to sleep, I'd made a decision that would change everything. Michael wanted a war over my stock options. He was going to get one, but not the kind he was expecting. The woman he'd threatened in that bridal suite was going to fight back with every weapon at her disposal, and she was going to win. Tomorrow, while David and Jennifer were beginning their honeymoon, I would begin the process of ending my marriage and protecting everything I'd worked to build. Michael thought he could manipulate me into submission by choosing our son's wedding day for his ambush. Instead, he'd chosen the perfect day for me to finally see who he really was and decide that I deserved better. The champagne flute that had shattered on the marble floor of the bridal suite wasn't the only thing that had broken that day. Michael's threats had shattered any illusion I'd had about our marriage being a partnership of equals. Now it was time to pick up the pieces and build something better from the wreckage he'd created. The morning after David's wedding dawned gray and drizzling, typical Portland weather that matched my mood perfectly. I woke up alone in our king-sized bed, still wearing the navy silk dress from the reception, with mascara smudged under my eyes and my hair tangled from a restless night of planning and plotting. Michael's side of the bed was cold, suggesting he'd never come upstairs after our confrontation in the kitchen. I found him in his study, slumped over his mahogany desk with his laptop open and financial documents scattered everywhere. Empty whiskey bottles lined the credenza behind his chair, and the room reeked of alcohol and desperation. He looked up when I entered, his eyes bloodshot and his expensive wedding suit wrinkled beyond repair. "Rachel, thank God," he said, struggling to his feet. "I've been working all night trying to find another solution. Maybe we don't need the full amount from your stock options. Maybe I can negotiate with Martinez for more time." I stood in the doorway, studying this man I'd lived with for 15 years, trying to reconcile the successful businessman I'd married with the desperate stranger who'd grabbed my throat less than 12 hours ago. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Whatever love I'd felt for Michael Thompson had died in that bridal suite. "Get dressed," I said calmly. "We're going to have breakfast, and then you're going to tell me everything about your business situation. No lies, no omissions, no attempts to manipulate me. If you want any chance of salvaging our marriage, you'll start with complete honesty." Hope flickered in his eyes as he interpreted my words as a willingness to negotiate. He didn't understand that I was gathering intelligence, not preparing to compromise. The breakfast conversation would give me the information I needed to protect myself and ensure Michael couldn't use our shared assets to dig his hole any deeper. We drove to Powell's Books Cafe in separate cars, a decision that probably should have told Michael something about my intentions. The iconic bookstore was nearly empty on this Sunday morning, with only a few early risers browsing the stacks while sipping coffee. I chose a corner table where we could speak privately, ordering black coffee and steel-cut oats while Michael requested a full breakfast he was too nervous to eat. "Start from the beginning," I said once the waitress had left us alone. "When did the problems with Northwest Construction Group actually start?" Michael stared into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to his predicament. "About 18 months ago. We landed the contract for that new office complex in the Pearl District, the one that was supposed to be our breakthrough into high-end commercial development." I remembered the celebration dinner we'd had when he'd announced winning that contract. Michael had been ecstatic, talking about how it would establish Northwest Construction Group as a major player in Portland's booming commercial market. He'd ordered champagne and made toasts about our bright future together. "The client seemed solid," Michael continued. "Westbridge Development had backing from California investors, and their plans looked ambitious but achievable. We signed contracts for 3 buildings totaling $42 million in construction value." "What went wrong?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Everything." Michael's voice was hollow, defeated. 6 months into the project, Westbridge's financing fell through. Their California investors pulled out when the commercial real estate market started showing signs of instability. Suddenly we had crews working on buildings that might never be completed, suppliers demanding payment for materials we'd already installed, and no money coming in from the client. The waitress brought our food, but neither of us touched it. Michael was lost in his recounting of the disaster, and I was focused entirely on gathering every detail that might be relevant to protecting my own interests. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. 18 months ago, we could have figured out a solution together. My business was doing well, and we had savings. Michael finally looked up at me, and I saw shame mixed with the desperation that had become his default expression, because I thought I could fix it. I'd never failed at anything before, Rachel. Northwest Construction Group was my company, my reputation, my legacy. I couldn't admit that I'd made such a catastrophic mistake. Instead of seeking help or cutting his losses, Michael had made the situation exponentially worse. He'd borrowed money from traditional lenders to keep his crews working, hoping Westbridge would find alternative financing. When that didn't happen, he'd taken on smaller projects at unrealistic profit margins, using new contracts to pay for the Pearl District disaster. "That's when you met Kevin Martinez," I said, watching his face carefully. Michael's expression darkened. "You know about Martinez?" "I know you borrowed money from him. What I don't know is how much, or what kind of terms you agreed to." The full story was worse than I'd imagined. Martinez had approached Michael 6 months ago, presenting himself as a legitimate investor interested in supporting local construction companies. His initial loan of $200,000 had seemed like a lifeline, with reasonable interest rates and flexible repayment terms. "The money kept us afloat for a while," Michael explained, "but Martinez's payments came with strings attached. He wanted regular updates on our projects, copies of our contracts, detailed financial statements. I thought he was just being cautious about his investment." What Michael had unknowingly done was give Martinez complete insight into Northwest Construction Group's operations and client relationships. When the initial loan wasn't enough to solve the company's problems, Martinez had been perfectly positioned to offer additional financing at increasingly predatory terms. "How much do you owe him now?" I asked. $800,000, Michael whispered, "plus interest that compounds weekly. If I don't make a payment by next Friday, the total jumps to over $1 million. The numbers were staggering, but what terrified me more was the realization that Michael had essentially handed over control of his company to a man with organized crime connections. Martinez wasn't just a predatory lender. He was positioning himself to take over Northwest Construction Group's client relationships and ongoing contracts. "Rachel, you have to understand," Michael continued, his voice becoming more desperate. "This isn't just about money anymore. Martinez has made it clear that failure to pay will have consequences beyond bankruptcy. He knows where we live, where David is stationed, where your business is located. He's not the kind of man who accepts financial losses gracefully." I felt ice water run through my veins as the full implications of Michael's situation became clear. My husband hadn't just gambled away his company. He'd put our entire family in danger by borrowing money from criminals. The stock options he wanted weren't just about saving his business. They were about preventing potential violence against people I loved. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before yesterday?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand his twisted logic, because I kept thinking I could find another way. "I've been working with brokers to sell some of our investment properties, trying to liquidate assets without involving you. But the real estate market is slow, and nothing's moving fast enough to meet Martinez's deadline." Michael had been living in a nightmare for months, watching his professional empire crumble while trying to protect our family from the consequences of his decisions. The man who'd grabbed my throat in the bridal suite wasn't just greedy or controlling. He was terrified and running out of options. Part of me felt sympathy for his predicament, but a larger part of me was furious that he'd created this situation through arrogance and poor judgment, then tried to solve it by threatening his wife instead of asking for help. The fact that he'd waited until our son's wedding day to reveal the truth told me everything I needed to know about his priorities and character. "Show me the contracts," I said. "I want to see everything you've signed with Martinez, every document related to the loans, every piece of correspondence between your companies." Michael reached into his briefcase and produced a thick folder of papers. As I reviewed the documents, my worst fears were confirmed. Martinez hadn't just loaned money to Northwest Construction Group. He'd structured the agreements to give himself legal claim to the company's assets if payments were missed. The contracts were sophisticated and thoroughly researched, clearly written by attorneys who specialized in predatory lending. Martinez had identified Michael as a desperate borrower and had crafted agreements that would allow him to seize control of an established construction company for a fraction of its actual value. "Michael, you realize what you've done, don't you?" I asked, setting the papers aside. "These contracts aren't loans. They're acquisition agreements disguised as financing arrangements. Martinez never intended for you to pay this money back. He wanted you to default so he could take over your company legally." The color drained from Michael's face as he absorbed what I was telling him. "That's impossible. Martinez told me he was helping local businesses, that he believed in Northwest Construction Group's potential. Martinez is a sophisticated criminal who identified your company as a valuable target. He researched your client relationships, your ongoing contracts, your reputation in the industry. When you defaulted on the Pearl District project, he saw an opportunity to acquire an established construction business through legal manipulation rather than outright theft." I could see Michael's world collapsing as he realized the full scope of his mistake. He'd thought he was dealing with a generous investor who'd offered him a lifeline. Instead, he'd been systematically deceived by a man who'd played him like a master chess player, executing a long-term strategy. "What am I going to do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "If Martinez takes over the company, he'll have access to all our client information, our ongoing projects, our reputation. He'll be able to destroy everything I've built while using my name and relationships to legitimize his operations." For the first time since the confrontation in the bridal suite, I felt genuine sympathy for Michael. He'd made terrible decisions, but he'd been manipulated by someone far more experienced in financial predation. The question was whether his mistakes were fixable, or whether the damage was too extensive to repair. "The stock options wouldn't solve this problem anyway," I told him. "Even if I agreed to use them as collateral, Martinez would just extend your repayment deadline while adding additional fees and penalties. You'd be trading temporary relief for even deeper long-term problems." Michael stared at me across the table, and I could see him grappling with the realization that his planned solution was actually another trap. "So what do I do? File for bankruptcy and hope Martinez doesn't follow through on his threats?" "We need professional help," I said. "This situation requires attorneys who specialize in organized crime and predatory lending. It requires investigators who can document Martinez's business practices and potentially identify other victims. It requires a coordinated strategy that protects our family while exposing Martinez's operations to law enforcement." The word "we" hung in the air between us, and I could see hope rekindling in Michael's eyes. He'd interpreted my statement as a commitment to help him fight Martinez, but what I'd actually meant was that we needed professional help to extricate ourselves from his situation safely. "Rachel, does this mean you'll help me?" he asked. "Will you consider using the stock options if it's part of a larger legal strategy?" I looked at this man I'd been married to for 15 years, this stranger who'd threatened me and put our family in danger through his arrogance and poor judgment. Whatever feelings I'd once had for him were buried beneath layers of betrayal and disappointment that would never fully heal. "Michael, I'll help you find legal representation, and I'll cooperate with any investigation that protects our family from Martinez. But my stock options are not available to solve your business problems. That decision is final and non-negotiable." His face fell as he realized I wasn't going to be the easy solution he'd hoped for. "But the lawyers will cost money, and investigators are expensive. How are we going to pay for professional help if we don't liquidate some assets?" "We'll figure it out," I said, standing up from the table. "But we'll figure it out without destroying my financial independence in the process." As we left Powell's books and walked to our separate cars, I could feel Michael watching me, probably trying to calculate whether he could still change my mind about the stock options. What he didn't understand was that our marriage had ended the moment he'd put his hands on my throat. Everything else was just logistics. The drive home gave me time to process the full scope of the situation Michael had created. His business problems were actually worse than I'd imagined, involving not just financial mismanagement, but potential criminal threats against our family. The stock options he wanted represented my only guaranteed financial security if our marriage ended and his assets were seized by Martinez. More troubling was the realization that Michael's judgment had been compromised for months, possibly years. The man who'd built a successful construction company through careful planning and calculated risk-taking had made a series of increasingly desperate decisions that suggested either mental instability or complete panic. When we arrived home, I found Michael in his study again, frantically making phone calls to attorneys and accountants. I could hear him explaining his situation in increasingly frantic terms, begging for immediate consultations and emergency legal advice. The desperation in his voice was painful to listen to, but it also reinforced my decision to protect my own interests. I retreated to my home office, the converted bedroom where I'd built Thompson Tech Solutions from a part-time consulting operation into a company worth millions. The walls were lined with awards and certificates, recognizing my achievements in software development and business management. This room represented everything I'd accomplished independently, everything Michael now wanted me to sacrifice for his mistakes. My laptop was exactly where I'd left it before the wedding, open to financial projections for the company's upcoming IPO. The numbers were even better than I'd hoped, with early investor interest suggesting our stock might be worth $4 million rather than the $3 million we'd originally projected. Those stock options represented more than money. They represented freedom, independence, and the ability to make my own choices about my future. Michael's demands that I use them to save his failing business were really demands that I sacrifice my autonomy to clean up his mistakes. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Patricia Hayes, my attorney, returning the call I'd made while Michael was showering. "Rachel, I got your message," Patricia said. "You mentioned needing immediate legal consultation about a family matter. Is everything all right?" Patricia had been my attorney for 3 years, helping me structure Thompson Tech Solutions for the IPO and handling various business matters. She was one of the few people who understood the full value of my stock options and the importance of protecting them from potential claims. "Patricia, I need to meet with you tomorrow morning," I said. "Michael has gotten himself into serious financial trouble, and he's demanding that I use my stock options to bail him out. I need to understand my legal position and explore my options for protecting my assets." There was a pause as Patricia processed what I was telling her. "Rachel, are you talking about a divorce?" "I'm talking about protecting myself from my husband's business mistakes," I replied carefully. "I need to understand what assets are considered marital property and what protections are available for my stock options specifically." "We should definitely meet as soon as possible," Patricia agreed. "This kind of situation requires immediate legal planning to protect your interests. Can you come in first thing tomorrow morning?" After hanging up with Patricia, I spent the rest of the afternoon researching divorce law in Oregon, asset protection strategies, and legal precedents for stock option disputes. The information I found was both encouraging and sobering. My stock options would likely be considered marital property subject to division. But there were strategies for protecting them if I could demonstrate that Michael's demands were unreasonable or financially destructive. More importantly, I learned that Oregon law provided significant protections for victims of domestic violence, including emergency orders that could prevent a spouse from accessing joint assets. Michael's physical aggression in the bridal suite qualified as domestic violence, giving me legal grounds to seek immediate protection for my financial interests. That evening, Michael emerged from his study looking even more defeated than he had that morning. His phone calls had apparently yielded little hope for immediate solutions to his Martinez problem. "The attorneys want retainers I can't afford," he told me. "The ones who specialize in organized crime cases are talking about $50,000 just to review Martinez's contracts and develop a defense strategy." "What about bankruptcy?" I asked. "Wouldn't that provide some protection from Martinez's claims?" Michael shook his head. "The lawyers think Martinez structured his contracts specifically to survive bankruptcy proceedings. He's done this before, Rachel. He targets successful businesses, lends money they can't repay, then seizes their assets through legal manipulation." The hopelessness in Michael's voice was almost overwhelming, but I forced myself to remain objective. His situation was tragic, but it was also entirely self-inflicted. He'd had multiple opportunities to seek help, to be honest with me about his problems, to make different choices. Instead, he'd gambled everything on increasingly desperate schemes. "Michael, I'm going to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly," I said. "If our situations were reversed, if I had made the kind of mistakes you've made and put our family in danger, would you sacrifice your most valuable asset to save me?" He was quiet for a long time, probably realizing that his answer would reveal everything about our relationship and his expectations for our marriage. "I would do whatever it took to protect our family," he finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's not what I asked," I replied. "I asked if you would sacrifice your most valuable asset, your financial independence, your future security, to fix mistakes that I had made without consulting you." Michael's silence was answer enough. He expected me to sacrifice everything for him, but he would never consider making similar sacrifices himself. The double standard was breathtaking in its audacity and completely consistent with the entitlement he displayed throughout our marriage. "I'm going to bed," I told him. "Tomorrow I'm meeting with my attorney to discuss my legal options. I suggest you do the same." As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I could hear Michael returning to his study, probably to continue his desperate search for alternative solutions. Part of me felt sorry for him, but a larger part of me was relieved that I'd finally seen his true character before it was too late to protect myself. Tomorrow would begin the process of legally separating my financial interests from Michael's disasters. The stock options that represented my life's work would remain mine, and Michael would have to find another way to solve the problems he'd created through arrogance and poor judgment. The woman who'd been threatened in that bridal suite was gone, replaced by someone who understood exactly what she was worth and wasn't willing to sacrifice her future for anyone else's mistakes. Michael Thompson was about to discover that his greatest asset hadn't been his construction company or his business relationships. It had been his wife, and he'd just lost her forever. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Portland feel alive with possibility. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Patricia Hayes, choosing a charcoal gray business suit that projected competence and authority. As I applied my makeup, I caught sight of the faint bruising around my throat where Michael's fingers had pressed into my skin. The marks were barely visible, but they served as a reminder of how quickly 15 years of marriage had disintegrated into something unrecognizable. Michael was already gone when I came downstairs, probably meeting with another attorney who couldn't afford to take his case. The kitchen still smelled like the coffee he'd brewed before dawn, and I found a note on the counter explaining that he'd be spending the day trying to negotiate an extension with Martinez. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, nothing like the confident script I'd grown accustomed to seeing on birthday cards and anniversary notes. Patricia Hayes maintained her law practice in a converted Victorian mansion in the Hawthorne district, surrounded by artisanal coffee shops and boutique stores that catered to Portland's creative class. Her office occupied the entire second floor, with tall windows that overlooked the Willamette River and walls lined with legal texts that spoke to her expertise in corporate law and asset protection. "Rachel, you look tired," Patricia said as she poured coffee from an antique silver service. "I take it the family matter you mentioned is more serious than I initially thought." I accepted the delicate china cup and settled into the leather chair across from her mahogany desk. Patricia was in her early 50s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and reading glasses that gave her a scholarly appearance. She'd built a reputation representing high-net-worth women in complex divorce proceedings, and her client list included several tech entrepreneurs who'd needed to protect their assets from predatory spouses. "Patricia, my husband physically assaulted me during our son's wedding reception," I said without preamble. "He's demanding that I use my stock options as collateral to save his failing construction business, and when I refused, he grabbed my throat and threatened me." Patricia's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips as she absorbed what I was telling her. "Rachel, are you safe? Do you need immediate protection?" "I'm safe for now," I replied. "Michael left early this morning to meet with his creditors. But I need to understand my legal options for protecting my assets and potentially ending our marriage." Over the next hour, I provided Patricia with a comprehensive overview of Michael's financial situation, his dealings with Kevin Martinez, and the escalating threats our family was facing. She took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timelines and dollar amounts. "The domestic violence incident gives us immediate grounds for emergency asset protection," Patricia explained. "Oregon law allows victims of domestic abuse to seek restraining orders that include financial protections. We could potentially freeze all joint accounts and prevent Michael from accessing any marital assets without court approval, The prospect of taking such dramatic action was both empowering and terrifying. What would that mean for Michael's ability to address his Martinez problem? It would mean that his business problems become his responsibility to solve without destroying your financial security. Patricia replied firmly. Rachel, you need to understand something fundamental about asset protection in divorce proceedings. Your obligation is to preserve marital property, not to sacrifice it to cover your spouse's debts. Patricia pulled out a thick legal folder and began reviewing documents related to Thompson Tech Solutions and my stock option agreements. The company's corporate structure had been carefully designed to protect my interests while maximizing the value of my ownership stake. Your stock options are particularly well protected, she noted. They were granted to you individually as compensation for your role as Chief Technology Officer, and the vesting schedule ties them directly to your personal performance rather than any marital contributions. A court would likely classify them as separate property, especially given that you founded the company before your marriage to Michael. The relief I felt was profound and immediate. The stock options represented more than financial security. They represented my professional identity and my ability to make independent choices about my future. Knowing that they were legally protected gave me the confidence to resist Michael's demands completely. What about our other assets? I asked. The house? Our investment properties? Our retirement accounts? Those would be subject to equitable distribution in a divorce, Patricia explained. But given Michael's financial misconduct and the threat he poses to marital assets through his dealings with Martinez, we could argue for a disproportionate award in your favor. Patricia recommended that we begin documenting everything immediately. She wanted copies of all financial records, evidence of Michael's business dealings, photographs of my injuries, and a detailed timeline of his threatening behavior. More importantly, she suggested that we hire a private investigator to gather additional evidence about Michael's relationship with Martinez and any other undisclosed debts or obligations. I know someone perfect for this kind of investigation, Patricia said, reaching for her phone. James Porter specializes in cases involving organized crime and predatory lending. He's worked with several of my clients who found themselves in similar situations. James Porter arrived at Patricia's office less than an hour later. A compact man in his early 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of our conversation. He'd spent 15 years as a detective with the Portland Police Bureau before starting his own investigative firm, and his expertise in financial crimes made him ideally suited for our situation. Mrs. Thompson, Patricia has given me a basic overview of your husband's situation, James said, settling into the third chair in Patricia's office. Before we proceed, I want you to understand what this kind of investigation typically involves and what we might uncover. James explained that men like Kevin Martinez rarely limited their operations to a single victim. If Michael had been targeted for a sophisticated acquisition scheme, there were probably other business owners in Portland who'd fallen into similar traps. Documenting Martinez's pattern of behavior would strengthen any legal action we might take while potentially helping other victims. What I typically find in these cases, James continued, is that the borrower's financial problems are worse than they initially admit, and the lender's criminal activities extend far beyond predatory lending. Your husband may have additional debts he hasn't disclosed, and Martinez may be involved in money laundering, racketeering, or other federal crimes. The prospect of uncovering even more problems was daunting, but I knew that information was power in this situation. How long would this investigation take? 2 to 3 weeks for a comprehensive report, James replied. But I can provide preliminary findings within a few days if we need to take immediate legal action. Patricia and James outlined a coordinated strategy that would protect my interests while gathering evidence for potential criminal prosecution of Martinez. The plan included surveillance of Michael's meetings with Martinez, financial analysis of Northwest Construction Group's records, background investigations of Martinez's other business associates, and documentation of any attempts to intimidate or threaten our family. The goal is to build a case that's strong enough to interest federal prosecutors, Patricia explained. If we can demonstrate that Martinez is running a criminal enterprise, the FBI will take over the investigation and provide witness protection for your family if necessary. The meeting concluded with me signing retainer agreements for both Patricia and James, along with authorizations that would allow them to access financial records and communicate with law enforcement on my behalf. The total cost would be substantial, but my stock options provided more than enough resources to fund a comprehensive defense of my interests. As I drove home from Patricia's office, I felt a mixture of empowerment and anxiety that was becoming familiar. Taking control of my situation felt liberating, but the scope of the problems we might uncover was genuinely frightening. Michael's business dealings had potentially exposed our family to criminal threats that extended far beyond simple financial difficulties. The house was still empty when I arrived, giving me an opportunity to begin gathering the documents Patricia had requested. Michael's study became my first target, with filing cabinets full of contracts, financial statements, and correspondence that told the story of his company's decline. What I found was worse than I'd expected. Michael had been lying about the timeline of his problems, the extent of his debts, and his relationship with Martinez. Documents buried in the back of his filing cabinet showed that he'd been borrowing money from questionable sources for over 2 years, long before the Pearl District project had failed. The earliest loan agreement I could find was dated 18 months before Michael had even bid on the West Bridge development contract. He'd borrowed $50,000 from a company called Pacific Investment Partners to cover payroll shortfalls and equipment purchases. The interest rate was reasonable, and the terms seemed legitimate, but the signature page included a personal guarantee that put our house at risk if the loan went into default. 6 months later, Michael had borrowed an additional $100,000 from the same company, this time to fund the down payment required for the Pearl District contract. The second loan carried a higher interest rate and included provisions that gave Pacific Investment Partners access to Northwest Construction Group's financial records and client information. The pattern became clear as I continued reviewing documents. Michael had been systematically borrowing money to maintain the appearance of success, while his company's actual financial position deteriorated steadily. Each new loan carried worse terms than the previous one, and each personal guarantee put more of our family's assets at risk. Most disturbing was the discovery that Pacific Investment Partners and Kevin Martinez's organization were the same entity. Martinez had been targeting Michael for over 2 years, gradually increasing his leverage and control while Michael believed he was dealing with multiple independent lenders. He'd ordered champagne and made toasts about our bright future together. The client seemed solid, Michael continued. Westbridge Development had backing from California investors, and their plans looked ambitious but achievable. We signed contracts for 3 buildings totaling $42 million in construction value. What went wrong? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Everything. Michael's voice was hollow, defeated. 6 months into the project, Westbridge's financing fell through. Their California investors pulled out when the commercial real estate market started showing signs of instability. Suddenly we had crews working on buildings that might never be completed, suppliers demanding payment for materials we'd already installed, and no money coming in from the client. The waitress brought our food, but neither of us touched it. Michael was lost in his recounting of the disaster, and I was focused entirely on gathering every detail that might be relevant to protecting my own interests. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. 18 months ago, we could have figured out a solution together. My business was doing well, and we had savings. Michael finally looked up at me, and I saw shame mixed with the desperation that had become his default expression. Because I thought I could fix it. I'd never failed at anything before, Rachel. Northwest Construction Group was my company, my reputation, my legacy. I couldn't admit that I'd made such a catastrophic mistake. Instead of seeking help or cutting his losses, Michael had made the situation exponentially worse. He'd borrowed money from traditional lenders to keep his crews working, hoping Westbridge would find alternative financing. When that didn't happen, he'd taken on smaller projects at unrealistic profit margins, using new contracts to pay for the Pearl District disaster. That's when you met Kevin Martinez, I said, watching his face carefully. Michael's expression darkened. You know about Martinez? I know you borrowed money from him. What I don't know is how much, or what kind of terms you agreed to. The full story was worse than I'd imagined. It meant that our family was being systematically targeted by sophisticated criminals who'd done their homework about our financial situation and potential vulnerabilities. How does he know about the stock options? I asked. Michael has been providing Martinez with copies of your joint tax returns and financial statements as part of his loan applications, James explained. Martinez has detailed information about your income, your business relationships, and your projected net worth after the IPO. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Not only had Michael put our family in danger through his poor business decisions, but he'd also provided criminals with intimate details about my financial affairs without my knowledge or consent. The stock options I'd worked 15 years to earn were now being targeted by money launderers who saw them as their next acquisition target. "What do we do now?" I asked. "We file for divorce tomorrow morning," James replied. "Patricia is already preparing the paperwork, including emergency motions for asset protection and restraining orders. We'll also be providing all of this information to the FBI agent who's been investigating Martinez." The coffee shop suddenly felt claustrophobic as the full scope of our situation became clear. Michael's financial problems weren't just threatening our marriage, they were threatening my freedom, my business, and potentially my life. Martinez and his organization wouldn't hesitate to use violence against anyone who interfered with their operations. "James, is my family safe?" I asked. "For now," he replied. "But that could change quickly if Martinez decides that you're not cooperating with his plans for your stock options. We need to move fast to establish legal protections and get federal authorities involved before this situation escalates." As I drove home through Portland's late afternoon traffic, I tried to process the complete transformation of my life in less than 48 hours. Saturday morning, I'd been a proud mother preparing for her son's wedding. By Monday afternoon, I was planning a divorce and considering witness protection from organized crime figures. The house felt different when I returned, charged with tension and the knowledge that my marriage was ending. Michael's car was in the driveway, suggesting that his meetings with Martinez hadn't gone well. I found him in the kitchen, staring at his laptop screen with the expression of a man who'd run out of options. "How did your meetings go?" I asked, trying to sound supportive despite everything I'd learned. "Martinez gave me until Friday," Michael replied without looking up. "After that, he's taking over the company and all its assets. He's also made it clear that our family's safety depends on my ability to find alternative sources of funding." I sat down across from Michael at our kitchen island, studying this man I'd lived with for 15 years, and trying to reconcile him with the stranger who'd been secretly documenting my financial affairs for criminals. The Michael I'd married would never have put our family in this kind of danger, but the Michael sitting across from me had been making increasingly desperate decisions for years. "Michael, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly," I said. "Have you given Martinez copies of our tax returns or financial statements?" His face went pale as he realized what I was asking. "Rachel, I had to provide documentation for the loan applications. Martinez needed to verify our household income and assets to determine how much money he could lend. So he knows about my stock options," I said. "He knows about Thompson Tech Solutions, the upcoming IPO, and the projected value of my shares." Michael's silence was confirmation enough. He'd not only betrayed our marriage by dealing with criminals, but he'd also provided those criminals with detailed intelligence about my business and financial position. "You've made me a target," I said quietly. "Martinez isn't just interested in your construction company anymore. He wants my stock options, and he's using threats against our family to pressure you into convincing me to cooperate." "Rachel, please," Michael said, his voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was protecting our family by trying to solve the problems myself." "You've destroyed our family," I replied, standing up from the table. "Your lies, your poor decisions, your willingness to put our safety at risk for your ego. Our marriage is over, Michael." I watched his face crumble as the finality of my words sank in. He'd probably been hoping that family loyalty would eventually overcome my anger, that I'd sacrifice my independence to save him one more time. Instead, he was discovering that his actions had consequences that couldn't be undone with apologies or promises. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you deal with the consequences of your choices," I said. "Tomorrow morning, my attorney is filing for divorce and seeking court orders to protect my assets from your criminal associates. You'll need to find your own lawyer and figure out how to cooperate with federal authorities without implicating yourself in money laundering charges." Michael stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of desperation and dawning comprehension that his world was ending. The successful businessman who'd commanded respect throughout Portland's construction industry was being reduced to a pawn in someone else's criminal enterprise. "Rachel, you can't abandon me now," he pleaded. "Whatever problems we have in our marriage, we're still family. We have obligations to each other." "Our only obligation now is to David," I replied. "And the best thing we can do for our son is to ensure that his parents don't end up in federal prison or witness protection because of your business dealings." As I headed upstairs to pack a bag, I could hear Michael making frantic phone calls, probably trying to find an attorney who specialized in federal criminal defense. The desperation in his voice was painful to listen to, but it was also a reminder of how completely he'd destroyed everything we'd built together. The woman who'd been threatened in that bridal suite was taking control of her life in ways that Michael had never imagined possible. Tomorrow would begin the legal process of protecting my independence and ensuring that his criminal mistakes couldn't destroy my future. Martinez and his organization were about to discover that they'd underestimated their latest target, and Michael was about to learn that actions have consequences that can't be negotiated away with more lies and manipulation. Tuesday morning arrived with the sound of my alarm cutting through the silence of the guest bedroom where I'd spent the night. I'd moved my belongings out of the master suite the evening before, needing physical distance from Michael while I processed the magnitude of his betrayal. The divorce papers Patricia had prepared lay on the nightstand beside me, ready to be filed within the hour. Michael was already gone when I came downstairs, his coffee cup abandoned in the sink, and his briefcase missing from its usual spot by the kitchen door. A handwritten note on the counter informed me that he was meeting with a criminal defense attorney downtown, finally acknowledging the gravity of his situation. Patricia's office was bustling with activity when I arrived at 8 a.m. sharp. Her paralegal had spent the night preparing emergency motions, and James Porter was waiting in the conference room with thick folders of evidence he'd gathered about Martinez's operation. The transformation of my quiet legal consultation into a war room was both empowering and surreal. "Rachel, we're filing everything this morning," Patricia announced as she handed me the divorce petition to review. Emergency restraining order, asset protection motions, and a formal request for federal intervention. By noon today, Michael will be legally prohibited from accessing any of your separate property or making decisions about joint assets. The divorce petition was comprehensive and devastating in its clinical precision. It detailed Michael's financial misconduct, his association with known criminals, and his physical assault during our son's wedding reception. Reading the legal description of my marriage's collapse was painful, but it also reinforced my determination to protect myself from further damage. "James has uncovered information that changes everything about our strategy," Patricia continued, gesturing toward the investigator who was arranging surveillance photographs on the conference table. James had spent Monday evening conducting surveillance of Michael's meeting with Martinez, documenting their interaction, and identifying additional members of Martinez's organization. The photographs showed Michael leaving a downtown restaurant with two men who'd been flagged by federal authorities as suspected money launderers. "Your husband is deeper into this criminal enterprise than we initially realized," James explained. "He's not just a victim of predatory lending. He's actively participating in Martinez's operations. These photographs show him receiving packages that were likely cash payments, designed to keep Northwest Construction Group operational, while Martinez assumes control." The evidence was damning and completely inconsistent with Michael's claims that he was merely a desperate borrower trying to save his company. The photographs showed him laughing and shaking hands with Martinez, appearing comfortable and familiar rather than intimidated or coerced. "There's more," James continued, producing a thick folder of financial documents. "Martinez's organization has been using Northwest Construction Group to launder money for 6 months. They're funneling drug proceeds through fake subcontractor payments and equipment purchases, then claiming legitimate business expenses on their tax returns." The scope of Michael's involvement was staggering. He'd transformed his once reputable construction company into a front for organized crime, allowing criminals to use his business relationships and banking connections to legitimize illegal income. Every project Northwest Construction Group had completed in recent months had potentially been funded with drug money. "What does this mean for Michael legally?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would be devastating. "It means he's facing federal charges for money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy," Patricia replied. The government will likely offer him a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against Martinez, but he's looking at significant prison time regardless. The woman I'd been just days ago would have been heartbroken by this news, devastated by the prospect of my husband facing decades in federal prison. The woman I'd become felt only cold satisfaction that Michael's actions were finally catching up with him. "James, what about the threats against our family?" I asked. "Are we safe while this legal process unfolds?" "That's where things get interesting," James replied with a slight smile. "Martinez doesn't know that we're documenting his organization or that federal authorities are involved. He still believes he can pressure you through Michael into surrendering your stock options voluntarily." James explained that Martinez's sophistication as a criminal was also his weakness. He'd spent years building legitimate business relationships and maintaining a respectable public image. The prospect of federal investigation and public exposure of his activities was genuinely threatening to his long-term operations. "We're going to use Martinez's caution against him," James continued. "Instead of hiding from his organization, we're going to make it clear that any threats against your family will result in immediate federal prosecution. Most criminals like Martinez would rather lose one potential score than risk their entire operation. The strategy was audacious and risky, but it offered the best chance of protecting our family while ensuring that Michael faced consequences for his choices." Patricia had already contacted the FBI agent investigating Martinez's organization, providing copies of all evidence we'd gathered and requesting immediate protection for our family. "Agent Sarah Chen will be joining us this afternoon," Patricia announced. "She's been building a case against Martinez for 2 years, and your evidence provides missing pieces that could finally result in indictments." The prospect of meeting with federal agents was intimidating, but it also represented the best path forward for protecting my interests and ensuring that Martinez couldn't threaten our family indefinitely. My stock options would remain secure, Michael would face justice for his crimes, and our family would be protected by the full weight of federal law enforcement. The morning's legal filings proceeded smoothly, with Patricia's team submitting emergency motions that would freeze Michael's access to our joint assets and establish legal protection for my separate property. The restraining order included provisions that prohibited Michael from contacting me except through attorneys, and prevented him from making any financial decisions that could affect our shared investments. By 11 a.m., I was legally separated from Michael's criminal activities and protected from any attempts to pressure me into sacrificing my stock options. The relief was profound and immediate, like emerging from a dark tunnel into bright sunlight. "Now we wait for Michael to be served with the papers," Patricia explained, as we reviewed the court's preliminary orders. "He'll have 24 hours to respond, and his attorney will likely request an emergency hearing to contest the asset freezes." The thought of Michael's reaction to the divorce papers was both satisfying and concerning. He'd probably assumed that family loyalty would eventually overcome my anger, that I'd ultimately choose our marriage over my independence. Instead, he was about to discover that his actions had destroyed any possibility of reconciliation. James Porter's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and his expression grew serious as he listened to whoever was on the other end. "That was my contact at the Portland Police Bureau," he announced after hanging up. "Martinez's organization knows that you've hired legal representation. They're accelerating their timeline for acquiring your stock options." The news that Martinez was aware of our legal maneuvering was unsettling but not unexpected. Criminals with his level of sophistication would have sources throughout the business community who could monitor court filings and legal activity. "What does that mean practically?" I asked. "It means they'll probably try to approach you directly instead of working through Michael," James replied. "Martinez has spent months researching your business and personal habits. He knows your daily routine, your business relationships, and your vulnerabilities." Patricia immediately called her security consultant, arranging for private protection while federal authorities developed their response strategy. The prospect of needing bodyguards felt surreal, but it was also a reminder that my decision to fight back had elevated the stakes considerably. "Rachel, I want you to understand something important," Patricia said as we prepared to leave her office. "The actions we've taken today have protected your legal interests, but they've also made you a target for people who don't respect legal boundaries. Until Martinez is arrested, you need to assume that you're being watched and potentially threatened. The reality of my situation was finally sinking in completely. Michael's criminal activities had transformed me from a successful businesswoman into a potential witness in a federal prosecution, requiring protection from organized crime figures who'd kill to protect their operations. Lunch consisted of takeout Chinese food eaten in Patricia's conference room while we prepared for the afternoon meeting with Agent Chen. James had prepared comprehensive briefing materials documenting Martinez's organization, Michael's involvement, and the timeline of events that had led to our current situation. Agent Sarah Chen arrived precisely at 2 p.m., a compact woman in her early 40s with intelligent eyes and the kind of calm authority that comes from years of investigating dangerous criminals. She wore a conservative navy suit and carried a leather briefcase that probably contained enough evidence to destroy Martinez's organization completely. "Mrs. Thompson, I appreciate your willingness to cooperate with our investigation," Agent Chen said as she settled into the conference room chair across from me. "The evidence you've provided fills significant gaps in our case against Martinez and his associates." Agent Chen explained that the FBI had been investigating Martinez's money laundering operation for over 2 years, building cases against multiple members of his organization while trying to identify the legitimate businesses he was using to process illegal funds. Northwest Construction Group had been on their radar for months, but they'd lacked sufficient evidence to obtain search warrants or make arrests. "Your husband's cooperation will be essential for prosecuting the entire organization," Agent Chen continued. "We're prepared to offer him a plea agreement in exchange for testimony, but he'll still face significant prison time for his participation in the money laundering scheme." The federal government's case against Martinez was complex and far-reaching, involving multiple criminal enterprises across the Pacific Northwest. His organization had been laundering money for drug cartels, human trafficking operations, and illegal gambling networks, using acquired businesses to legitimize millions of dollars in criminal proceeds. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to be frank with you about the risks you're facing," Agent Chen said. "Martinez's organization has a history of using violence against people who threaten their operations. Your decision to resist their demands and cooperate with law enforcement puts you in potential danger." The FBI was prepared to offer witness protection if necessary, but Agent Chen hoped that wouldn't be required. Martinez's sophistication as a criminal made him reluctant to use violence that might attract federal attention, preferring legal manipulation and financial pressure to achieve his objectives. "Our strategy is to arrest Martinez and his key associates within the next 72 hours, Agent Chen explained. "We have enough evidence to obtain indictments, and your husband's cooperation will strengthen our case considerably." The timeline was aggressive but necessary. Martinez had given Michael until Friday to secure additional funding, and federal authorities wanted to act before his organization could escalate their pressure tactics or target other potential victims. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Continue your normal business activities while remaining vigilant about potential surveillance or contact from Martinez's people," Agent Chen replied. "If anyone approaches you about your stock options or attempts to pressure you financially, contact us immediately." The meeting concluded with Agent Chen providing me with secure communication devices and emergency contact numbers that would connect me directly to federal agents 24 hours a day. The technology felt like something from a spy movie, but it was also reassuring to know that professional law enforcement was monitoring my safety. As Agent Chen prepared to leave, she handed me a thick envelope containing preliminary financial analysis of Martinez's money laundering operation. "Mrs. Thompson, you should know that your husband's participation in this scheme has generated substantial illegal income for his company. The government will likely seek forfeiture of any assets that can be traced to criminal proceeds." The implications were staggering. Northwest Construction Group's recent profitability hadn't been the result of successful business operations. It had been generated by laundering drug money and other criminal proceeds. Michael hadn't just made poor business decisions. He'd built his recent success on a foundation of organized crime. "Will this affect our joint assets?" I asked. "Potentially," Agent Chen replied, "but your stock options and independent business income should be protected since they have no connection to your husband's criminal activities." The afternoon concluded with Patricia and James developing a comprehensive security plan for my immediate protection while federal authorities finalized their case against Martinez. Private security would monitor my home and office, federal agents would maintain surveillance of Martinez's organization, and emergency response procedures would ensure my safety if the situation escalated. As I drove home through Portland's early evening traffic, I felt a strange mixture of fear and empowerment that was becoming familiar. My decision to resist Michael's demands had unleashed forces that were completely beyond my control, but it had also positioned me to emerge from this crisis with my independence intact and my financial security protected. The house felt different when I arrived, charged with the knowledge that my marriage was ending and that federal agents were preparing to arrest my husband for serious crimes. Michael's car was in the driveway, but I could see through the kitchen windows that he was on the phone, probably discussing legal strategy with his criminal defense attorney. I found Michael in his study, surrounded by legal documents and looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him. The confident businessman who'd built Northwest Construction Group from nothing had been reduced to a criminal defendant, hoping for a plea agreement that might limit his prison sentence. "Rachel, we need to talk," he said as I appeared in the doorway. "My attorney says you've filed for divorce and frozen our assets. He thinks we can work out an arrangement that protects your interests, while allowing me to address the Martinez situation." I remained standing in the doorway, maintaining physical distance from this man who'd betrayed our family in ways I was still discovering. "Michael, there's nothing to work out. Our marriage is over, and your criminal problems are your responsibility to solve." "You don't understand," Michael continued, his voice taking on the desperate tone that had become his default. "Martinez is escalating his demands. He wants a meeting with you directly to discuss the stock options. If you don't cooperate, he's threatened to target David and Jennifer during their honeymoon." The threat against our son was the final straw, confirming everything Agent Chen had told me about Martinez's willingness to use violence against innocent family members. Michael had not only destroyed our marriage and our financial security, he'd also put our children in danger through his criminal associations. "Michael, Martinez is going to be arrested within the next few days," I said calmly. "The FBI has been investigating his organization for 2 years, and your cooperation has provided the evidence they need for indictments." Michael's face went white as he processed what I was telling him. "You're working with federal agents?" "I'm protecting our family from the criminals you've been doing business with," I replied. "Agent Chen expects you to cooperate fully with their investigation in exchange for a plea agreement that might reduce your prison sentence." I could see Michael's world collapsing completely as he realized that his wife had outmaneuvered him at every turn. He'd expected me to be intimidated by his criminal associates, to sacrifice my independence to save him from the consequences of his choices. Instead, I'd allied myself with federal law enforcement and positioned myself to emerge from his crimes with my assets protected and my freedom intact. "Rachel, please," he said, his voice breaking completely. "Don't let them destroy our family. We can find another way to handle this situation." "You destroyed our family when you chose to do business with criminals," I replied. "You destroyed our family when you threatened me in front of our son's wedding guests. You destroyed our family when you put our children's safety at risk for money." Michael stared at me across his study, probably trying to reconcile the submissive wife he thought he'd married with the formidable opponent who was systematically dismantling his life. The woman he'd threatened in that bridal suite had revealed herself to be far more dangerous than any criminal he'd ever encountered. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now you cooperate with federal agents and hope they're satisfied with your testimony," I said. "You'll probably serve several years in federal prison, and when you're released, you'll start over with nothing except whatever skills you can remember from before you decided to become a criminal." As I turned to leave his study, Michael made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his choices. "Rachel, after everything we've built together, everything we've shared, you're just gonna walk away?" I paused in the doorway and looked back at this stranger who'd once been my husband. "Michael, you walked away from our marriage the moment you decided that threatening your wife was an acceptable way to solve your business problems. I'm just making it official." The woman who'd been assaulted in that bridal suite was about to watch her attacker face federal prosecution while she emerged from his criminal activities with her independence, her assets, and her dignity intact. Martinez's organization had underestimated their target, and Michael had discovered that actions have consequences that can't be negotiated away with more lies and manipulation. Tomorrow would bring the final phase of this crisis, as federal agents moved to arrest Martinez and his associates, while I began rebuilding my life free from the criminal shadows that had threatened to destroy everything I'd worked to achieve. Wednesday morning broke with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after a storm has passed, leaving the world washed clean and full of possibility. I woke in the guest bedroom for what I knew would be the last time, surrounded by moving boxes I'd packed the night before. Today would bring the culmination of everything I'd set in motion since Michael's assault in the bridal suite, and I felt a calm determination that surprised me with its intensity. Agent Chen had called at dawn to confirm that federal arrests would begin at precisely 9 a.m. Martinez and 6 members of his organization would be taken into custody simultaneously across Portland, ending their money laundering operation and neutralizing the threat they posed to our family. Michael would be arrested as well, though his cooperation had earned him the possibility of a reduced sentence. I dressed carefully in a navy business suit, the same professional attire I'd worn to build Thompson Tech Solutions from a one-woman consulting operation into a company worth millions. Today felt like a graduation of sorts, the formal end of one chapter of my life, and the beginning of something entirely new. Patricia Hayes arrived at my house at 7:30, accompanied by James Porter and a federal marshal who would oversee Michael's surrender to authorities. The kitchen that had once been the heart of our family home had been transformed into a command center, with laptops displaying real-time surveillance feeds and secure communication devices connecting us to the FBI operation. "Rachel, are you ready for this?" Patricia asked as she reviewed the final divorce decree that would be submitted once Michael was officially in custody. "Once the arrests begin, there's no going back. Your marriage will be legally terminated, and Michael will be facing federal prosecution." I looked around the kitchen, where Michael and I had shared thousands of meals, where we'd helped David with homework and celebrated birthdays, and planned what I'd thought was our future together. The memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, to a woman who'd been willing to accept less than she deserved, in the name of family harmony. "I've been ready since the moment he put his hands on my throat," I replied. "Michael made his choices, and now he'll face the consequences." James Porter was monitoring multiple surveillance feeds on his laptop, tracking the movements of Martinez's associates as federal agents moved into position throughout the city. The operation was complex and coordinated, designed to prevent any members of the organization from escaping or destroying evidence. "Martinez is at his office in the Pearl District," James reported. "His lieutenants are scattered across town, but federal agents have eyes on all of them. The arrests should proceed smoothly." The federal marshal, a compact woman named Detective Rodriguez, reviewed the protocols for Michael's surrender with clinical precision. He would be allowed to dress appropriately and gather essential personal items before being transported to federal holding facilities downtown. The process would be dignified but firm, reflecting his status as a cooperating witness rather than a flight risk. "Where is your husband now?" Detective Rodriguez asked. "Still in his study," I replied. "He's been on the phone with his attorney since 5 a.m., probably going over his testimony one final time." Michael had spent the past 2 days working with federal prosecutors to document his involvement in Martinez's money laundering operation. His cooperation had been complete and devastating, providing evidence that would ensure lengthy prison sentences for everyone involved in the scheme. At 8:15, my phone buzzed with a message from Agent Chen, confirming that all teams were in position and ready to begin the arrests. The precision and coordination of the federal operation was impressive, reflecting months of careful planning and investigation. "It's time," Patricia announced, checking her watch. "Rachel, you should say goodbye to Michael before the marshal takes him into custody." I found Michael in his study, surrounded by boxes of documents he'd prepared for federal prosecutors. He looked older than his 55 years, worn down by weeks of stress, and the knowledge that his life as he'd known it was ending. The confident businessman who'd built Northwest Construction Group from nothing had been replaced by someone hollow and defeated. "The arrests are beginning," I told him simply. "Detective Rodriguez is here to transport you downtown." Michael looked up from the financial records he'd been reviewing, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the man I'd married 15 years ago. "Rachel, I know I've destroyed everything between us, but I want you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. "I know you didn't," I replied, and found that I meant it. But meaning to do something and actually doing it are different things. You chose to threaten me instead of trusting me. You chose to do business with criminals instead of asking for help. You chose to put our family in danger rather than admit your mistakes. Michael stood up slowly, gathering his dignity for what he knew would be his final moments as a free man. "What happens to us now?" "There is no us anymore," I said gently. "You'll serve your time, and I'll rebuild my life. Maybe someday you'll understand that what happened to our marriage was the consequence of your choices, not something that was done to you." Detective Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, her presence a reminder that this conversation was ending whether we were ready or not. "Mr. Thompson, it's time to go." Michael gathered his jacket and the briefcase containing documents for his attorney, moving with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain composure under extreme stress. As he passed me in the doorway, he paused for just a moment. "I'm sorry, Rachel," he said quietly, "for all of it." "I know you are," I replied. "But sorry doesn't undo the damage." I watched from the kitchen window as Detective Rodriguez led Michael to her unmarked car, his hands cuffed behind his back but his head held high. Neighbors who'd known us for years watched from their windows and porches, probably wondering what crime the successful businessman from the Tudor house had committed. At exactly 9 a.m., Patricia's phone rang with confirmation that Martinez had been arrested at his office. Over the next 30 minutes, similar calls confirmed the arrests of his 6 associates, effectively dismantling the entire money laundering operation. The criminal enterprise that had threatened our family was gone, neutralized by federal law enforcement with surgical precision. "It's over," James Porter announced, closing his laptop with satisfaction. "Martinez and his people are in custody, Michael is cooperating with prosecutors, and you're safe." The relief I felt was profound and immediate, like finally exhaling after holding my breath for weeks. The criminals who'd targeted my family were facing federal prosecution, the husband who'd betrayed me was facing justice, and I was free to rebuild my life on my own terms. Patricia produced the final divorce decree, a document that would legally terminate my marriage to Michael and establish my complete independence from his criminal activities. My signature felt ceremonial, the formal ending of a relationship that had died the moment Michael chose violence over honesty. "Congratulations, Rachel," Patricia said as I handed her the signed papers. "You're officially divorced and legally protected from any claims on your assets." The Thompson Tech Solutions stock options that Michael had demanded remained mine, protected by court orders and federal law from any attempts to use them for criminal purposes. The company's IPO was proceeding on schedule, and early estimates suggested my shares would be worth even more than projected. James Porter was already developing security protocols for my transition to independence, ensuring that I could resume normal business activities without fear of retaliation from Martinez's remaining associates. The criminal organization had been dismantled, but caution remained appropriate until all legal proceedings were concluded. "What about David and Jennifer?" I asked. "Do they need to know about the arrests and Michael's situation?" "Agent Chen recommends waiting until they return from their honeymoon," Patricia replied. "The immediate threat has been neutralized, and there's no reason to ruin their trip with news they can't act on anyway." The decision to protect our children from the full scope of their father's crimes felt right, though I knew the conversation would be inevitable. David deserved to understand why his parents' marriage had ended and why his father was facing federal prosecution. By noon, the house was empty, except for me and the moving crew I'd hired to transport my belongings to the downtown loft I'd purchased near Thompson Tech Solutions offices. The Tudor home where I'd spent 15 years of my life would be sold as part of the divorce settlement, but I felt no sadness at leaving it behind. The loft was everything the family home hadn't been: modern, efficient, and entirely mine. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Willamette River, and the open design reflected my new priorities of simplicity and independence. I'd bought it with income from my consulting business, another symbol of my financial autonomy. As the movers carried the last of my possessions into my new home, I felt a sense of completion that was both satisfying and surreal. 5 days ago, I'd been a married woman celebrating her son's wedding. Now I was a divorced businesswoman who'd helped federal authorities dismantle a criminal organization. The transformation had been rapid and complete, but it had also revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed. The quiet, supportive wife who'd accommodated Michael's needs for 15 years had been replaced by someone who refused to compromise her independence for anyone else's convenience. My phone rang with a call from Linda Chen, my financial advisor, confirming that Thompson Tech Solutions' IPO had been fast-tracked due to exceptional investor interest. The stock offering would launch within 4 weeks rather than the original 6-month timeline, meaning my financial independence would be secured even sooner than expected. "Rachel, the market response has been extraordinary," Linda explained. "Your reputation for innovation and integrity has attracted investors who see Thompson Tech Solutions as exactly the kind of company they want to support. The board is talking about expanding the offering to meet demand." The irony was delicious. While Michael's business had collapsed due to criminal associations and poor judgment, my company was thriving because of the professional reputation I'd built through honest work and ethical practices. The stock options he'd demanded would be worth even more than we'd originally projected. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my new loft watching the sun set over Portland's skyline. The city looked different from this perspective, full of possibility rather than obligation. I felt like an explorer who'd discovered new territory, ready to chart a course that served my own interest rather than someone else's expectations. My phone buzzed with a text from David, sent from their honeymoon in Italy. "Mom, Jennifer and I are having an amazing time. Thank you for making our wedding so perfect. We love you." The message brought tears to my eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. David's happiness was genuine and uncontaminated by his father's crimes. Whatever challenges lay ahead for our family, my son had married the woman he loved in a ceremony that would remain a beautiful memory. I'd protected what mattered most while eliminating what threatened our future. David would learn about his father's situation when he returned from his honeymoon, but the immediate crisis was over, and the legal proceedings would ensure that justice was served. Friday afternoon brought news that Martinez had been denied bail due to flight risk concerns and the severity of the charges against him. His money laundering operation had processed over $40 million in criminal proceeds, funding everything from drug trafficking to human smuggling. The federal prosecution would likely result in life imprisonment. Michael's cooperation had been essential to building the case against Martinez, earning him a plea agreement that reduced his potential sentence from 25 years to 8 years in federal prison. He would serve his time at a minimum security facility and would be eligible for early release with good behavior. The justice felt appropriate and measured. Michael would face consequences for his crimes, but he would eventually have the opportunity to rebuild his life. Martinez and his associates, who'd built their wealth on violence and exploitation, would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Agent Chen called that evening to provide a final update on the case and to thank me for my cooperation. "Mrs. Thompson, your courage in coming forward made this prosecution possible." Martinez's organization had been operating with impunity for years because their victims were too frightened to seek help. "I had excellent legal representation and the protection of federal law enforcement," I replied. "Other victims might not have those advantages." "That's true," Agent Chen agreed. "But you also had the strength to recognize that your husband's problems weren't your responsibility to solve. Many people in your situation would have sacrificed their own security to protect their spouse." The comment highlighted the fundamental choice I'd faced: enable Michael's destructive behavior or protect my own interests. The decision had been easier than I'd expected, probably because Michael's assault had clarified exactly what kind of person he'd become. 2 weeks later, Thompson Tech Solutions' IPO launched to unprecedented investor enthusiasm. My stock options were worth $4.2 million on the opening day of trading, providing financial security that would last for the rest of my life. The company I'd built from nothing had become my pathway to complete independence. The local business community's response to my success was gratifying and revealing. Clients who dealt with Michael through Northwest Construction Group began approaching Thompson Tech Solutions directly, attracted by my reputation for ethical business practices and technical expertise. "Rachel, we always knew you were the brains behind Michael's operation," one potential client told me during a lunch meeting. "Now that you're available independently, we'd like to discuss some projects that require your specific skills. The comment stung because it contained more truth than I wanted to acknowledge. I had been instrumental in Michael's success, managing his finances and providing strategic guidance, while he received public credit for our shared achievements. His downfall had inadvertently highlighted my own capabilities. Patricia Hayes called to inform me that the divorce settlement had been finalized without complications. Michael's assets were being liquidated to pay restitution to Martinez's victims, but my separate property remained completely protected. The house would sell within the month, and I would receive my share of the proceeds. "You've handled this entire situation perfectly," Patricia told me. "I've represented dozens of women in similar circumstances, and most of them make compromises that damage their long-term interests. You prioritized your own welfare without apology, and the results speak for themselves." The praise felt validating, but it also raised questions about the woman I'd been before this crisis. Had I always possessed the strength to protect my interests? Or had Michael's betrayal revealed capabilities I'd never needed to use? The answer probably didn't matter. What mattered was moving forward with confidence in my own judgment. David and Jennifer returned from their honeymoon on a Tuesday, tanned and happy and full of stories about Italian architecture and cuisine. I met them at the airport, dreading the conversation we needed to have about their father's situation, but determined to handle it honestly. "Mom, you look amazing," David said as he hugged me. Different somehow, more relaxed. "I have some things to tell you about your father and me," I replied gently. "Let's go to my new place and talk." The conversation lasted 3 hours and covered everything from Michael's criminal activities to our divorce to his cooperation with federal authorities. David's reaction progressed from shock to anger to disappointment, but he handled the news with the maturity I'd expected from a decorated Marine. "Dad always seemed to think he was smarter than everyone else," David said finally. "I guess you found out he wasn't." Jennifer, who'd only known Michael as a successful businessman and devoted father, struggled more with the revelations. "How could he put your family in that kind of danger?" she asked. "How could he threaten you at our wedding?" "People make choices that reveal who they really are," I replied. "Your father chose to prioritize his ego over our family's safety. I chose to protect myself and rebuild my life." David wanted to visit Michael in federal prison, a decision I supported despite my own feelings about his father's crimes. Whatever Michael had done to our marriage, he remained David's father and deserved the opportunity to maintain that relationship. "Will you ever forgive him?" David asked as they prepared to leave. "I've already forgiven him," I replied honestly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. What your father did changed us both in ways that can't be undone." Christmas arrived with snow blanketing Portland and my new life settling into comfortable routines. Thompson Tech Solutions was thriving beyond all projections, with contracts that would keep us busy for years. My personal net worth had grown to over $6 million, providing security I'd never imagined possible. The loft had been decorated for the holidays with understated elegance that reflected my evolving taste for simplicity and quality. David and Jennifer joined me for Christmas dinner, a quiet celebration that focused on gratitude rather than tradition. "This is the best Christmas I've had in years," David said as we opened gifts in front of the fireplace. "You seem so happy, Mom. So free." The observation was accurate and profound. I was happy in ways I'd forgotten were possible, liberated from the need to accommodate someone else's expectations or clean up someone else's mistakes. My days belonged to me, my decisions served my interests, and my future was entirely my own to determine. Michael called from federal prison on New Year's Eve, our first conversation since his arrest 6 months earlier. He sounded older and more humble, changed by the experience of incarceration and the loss of everything he'd worked to build. "Rachel, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I want you to know that I understand now how badly I hurt you. I spent our entire marriage taking your support for granted, and when I was in trouble, I tried to take your independence too." "I appreciate you saying that," I replied and found that I meant it. "How are you managing in prison?" "It's difficult, but I'm learning things about myself that I probably needed to learn," Michael admitted. I'm working with a counselor who specializes in addiction, and I'm beginning to understand that my need to control everything was its own kind of disease. The conversation lasted 20 minutes and covered topics we'd never discussed honestly during our marriage. Michael talked about his fear of failure, his inability to ask for help, and his assumption that I would always be available to solve his problems. I talked about feeling taken for granted, undervalued, and ultimately betrayed by someone I'd trusted completely. "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me completely?" Michael asked before we ended the call. "I already have," I replied. "But Michael, forgiveness doesn't mean I'm willing to rebuild what we lost. Some things, once broken, can't be repaired." "I understand," he said sadly. "I just hope that someday you'll remember some of the good times we had together." "I remember all of it," I assured him. "The good and the bad, the love and the betrayal. It's all part of my story now." As winter gave way to spring, I began accepting speaking engagements about entrepreneurship and business ethics. My story of building a successful company while navigating personal crisis resonated with audiences, particularly women who were struggling to balance career ambitions with family obligations. "The most important lesson I've learned," I told a conference of female entrepreneurs in Seattle, "is that you can't build lasting success by sacrificing your own interests for someone else's convenience. True partnership requires mutual respect and shared sacrifice, not one person consistently accommodating the other's needs." The speaking engagements led to consulting opportunities with women-owned businesses throughout the Pacific Northwest. My experience with Thompson Tech Solutions' growth and IPO made me a valuable advisor for companies preparing for their own expansion phases. The work was fulfilling in ways that surprised me, connecting me with entrepreneurs who shared my values of independence and ethical business practices. I was building a new professional identity that reflected my actual capabilities, rather than my willingness to support someone else's vision. David and Jennifer announced their first pregnancy on Mother's Day, sharing news that filled me with joy and anticipation. The baby would arrive in December, giving me something wonderful to look forward to as my new life continued to unfold. "I hope I can be the kind of parent you've been to me," David said as we celebrated the pregnancy announcement over dinner. "Strong enough to make difficult decisions when they're necessary." "You already are," I assured him. "The fact that you're thinking about these things means you'll make good choices." That summer brought news that Martinez had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His money laundering operation had been completely dismantled, and several of his victims had recovered portions of their lost assets through federal restitution programs. Michael's cooperation had been instrumental in the prosecution, earning him a commendation from federal authorities and the possibility of early release for good behavior. He would likely serve 5 years rather than the full 8-year sentence, but he would emerge from prison as a convicted felon with limited career prospects. The justice felt complete and appropriate. Martinez would spend the rest of his life in prison for his crimes, Michael would face consequences for his participation in criminal activities, and I would continue building the independent life I'd chosen over enabling his destructive behavior. Thompson Tech Solutions celebrated its second anniversary as a public company with revenues that exceeded all projections. The stock I'd refused to sacrifice for Michael's criminal debts was now worth over $8 million, providing financial security that would last for generations. The company's success had attracted acquisition interest from several major technology firms, but I decided to maintain independence rather than sell to larger competitors. Thompson Tech Solutions would continue operating as an independent company that reflected my values of innovation, integrity, and ethical business practices. Fall arrived with David and Jennifer preparing for their baby's arrival, and my new life settling into patterns that reflected my priorities and preferences. The loft had become a sanctuary where I could focus on work, relationships, and personal growth without the stress of managing someone else's crises. My social circle had evolved to include entrepreneurs, artists, and professionals who shared my interest in building meaningful careers while maintaining personal integrity. The relationships felt more authentic than the business networking I'd done as Michael's wife, based on shared values rather than mutual convenience. The baby arrived on a snowy December morning, a healthy girl they named Rachel Thompson. Holding my granddaughter for the first time brought tears of joy and a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with my professional achievements or financial success. "She's perfect," I whispered as Grace slept in my arms, her tiny fingers wrapped around mine with surprising strength. Just like her grandmother, David said, watching us with the expression of wonder that new fathers wear when they're seeing their children for the first time. The comment made me think about the woman Grace would grow up knowing as her grandmother. She would know someone strong and independent, someone who'd built a successful business and made difficult choices to protect her family. She would never know the accommodating wife who'd spent 15 years managing someone else's life. That evening, as I sat in my loft watching snow fall over Portland's skyline, I reflected on the remarkable transformation my life had undergone. 2 years ago, I'd been a married woman whose identity was largely defined by her role as a supportive spouse. Now I was an independent entrepreneur who'd built a multi-million-dollar company and helped federal authorities dismantle a criminal organization. The journey had been painful and frightening, but it had also revealed capabilities I'd never known I possessed. Michael's betrayal had forced me to choose between enabling his destructive behavior and protecting my own interests. And I'd chosen independence over accommodation. The stock options he'd demanded were now worth more than $10 million, providing financial security that would allow me to make choices based on personal satisfaction rather than economic necessity. The company I'd built was thriving, the family I'd protected was safe, and the criminals who'd threatened us were facing justice. Michael would complete his prison sentence in 3 years, emerging as a convicted felon who'd lost everything he'd worked to build. He would have the opportunity to rebuild his life, but he would do so without the woman who'd spent 15 years supporting his dreams and cleaning up his mistakes. The woman who'd been assaulted in that bridal suite was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to compromise her independence for anyone else's convenience. The transformation had been complete and irreversible, revealing strengths that had been hidden beneath years of accommodation and compromise. Grace stirred in her crib, making the soft sounds that babies make when they're transitioning between sleep and wakefulness. I picked her up gently, marveling at how someone so small could represent such enormous possibility and hope. "You're gonna grow up in a different world than I did," I whispered to her as she settled back into sleep. "A world where women can build their own success and protect their own interests without apology." The promise felt like a blessing and a commitment, a recognition that the choices I'd made during my crisis would influence not just my own future but the example I set for the next generation. Grace would know that strength and independence were options, not sacrifices. My phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia Hayes, checking in on my adjustment to grandmother status and confirming our meeting next week to discuss the charitable foundation I was establishing. The foundation would provide legal assistance to women facing domestic violence and financial abuse, using my experience to help others navigate similar crises. The work felt like a natural extension of everything I'd learned during my own transformation. Women who were being threatened or manipulated by their spouses deserved access to the same legal protections and professional support that had enabled my escape from Michael's criminal activities. The foundation would be funded entirely by my Thompson Tech Solutions stock, ensuring that my financial independence could serve purposes beyond personal security. The money Michael had demanded to save his failing business would instead be used to help other women protect themselves from similar threats. The irony was perfect and deeply satisfying. The stock options that had represented my economic freedom would now provide freedom for women who found themselves in circumstances similar to mine. Michael's attempt to control my financial resources had ultimately led to those resources being used to empower other women. As midnight approached on New Year's Eve, I stood on my balcony watching fireworks explode over the Willamette River. Portland looked different from this perspective, a city full of opportunity rather than obligation. The woman I'd become was someone I genuinely liked and respected, someone who'd discovered her own strength through crisis and emerged transformed. The next chapter of my life would be written entirely on my own terms, guided by values of independence, integrity, and authentic relationship. Grace would grow up knowing a grandmother who'd chosen strength over accommodation, who'd built something meaningful from the wreckage of betrayal. The transformation that had begun in a bridal suite with a man's hands around my throat had culminated in financial independence, criminal justice, and the opportunity to help other women discover their own strength. Michael's greatest assault on my autonomy had become the catalyst for my complete liberation. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals become the foundation for our greatest victories, and sometimes the people who tried to destroy us end up revealing strengths we never knew we possessed. The woman who'd been threatened at her son's wedding had emerged as someone capable of dismantling criminal organizations and building multi-million-dollar companies. The future stretched ahead with infinite possibility, unmarked by anyone else's expectations or limitations. I was exactly who I was meant to be, and Grace would grow up knowing that strength and independence were always options for women brave enough to claim them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up.